Welcome to Everything Co-op, bringing you information on how cooperatives can help improve your quality of life. This show is being sponsored by the National Co-op Bank, NCB. The NCB is dedicated to strengthening communities nationwide for the delivery of banking and financial services for the nation's cooperatives, their members, and other socially responsible organizations. For more information on the power of community ownership, visit ncb.coop. That's ncb.coop. Now stay tuned for your host, Vernon Oakes.
Good morning, everybody. This is Vernon Oakes, and welcome to Everything Co-op. This morning, we're going to talk about the election. I'm going to talk about the election with Doug O'Brien, who's Executive Director of the National Cooperative, NCBA, National Cooperative Business Association. Good morning, Doug.
Hey, good morning, Vernon. Great to be with you again.
Great to have you on with such an exciting conversation about the election and the effect of the election on co-ops. First off, can you tell us how you became the Executive Director of NCBA and what is NCBA?
Sure. Yeah, the National Cooperative Business Association, CLUSA International. So it's a mouthful, kind of shorthand. We call it NCBA. We're the umbrella group for all kinds of cooperatives here in the United States. We do advocacy and public awareness and thought leadership, and then we also do a lot of international development work. We have for over 70 years, and more recently, we're doing work right here in the United States on co-op development. So in our membership, we have the associations of essentially every sector of cooperatives, credit unions, farmer cooperatives. We've got the rural electric cooperatives, housing cooperatives, worker cooperatives, food cooperatives, etc. And then we have individual co-ops as our members as well. So that's who NCBA CLUSA is. How I got here, to your question, Vernon, I did policy for years in the U.S. Senate and a couple governors, a couple state houses, and then I ended up at the U.S. Department of Agriculture in the White House during the Obama years, working on cooperative issues as well as a lot of other community economic development issues.
So you've been around a minute, doing a lot of different things. Okay.
Yeah, okay. I guess to the point of the conversation today, I've seen many administrations and Congresses come. I've seen them go. I've been in some of those Congresses and some of those administrations. So I've kind of seen the cycle.
Okay. So what do you kind of think this cycle now? This is Trump's second term. What do you think about that, just in a broad sense?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting to think about. So it's, in some ways, we have a pretty decent idea of how a Trump administration is going to approach the domestic economy, and that's because we've seen it before. And in fact, in 2017 and 2018, when President Trump was first elected, the Congress was actually controlled by Republicans for those first 2 years, which right now looks like that's going to happen again. Certainly the Senate will be controlled by Republicans, and it's still some question on the House. There's still some races to be called there, but as of this morning, it's looking like it'll probably be a very narrow margin and controlled by Republicans. So we've kind of seen this before. And in terms of what does it mean for cooperative priorities in the cooperative community, like any new administration, there's some good things and there's some things that might be a little bit more challenging for us to advance. And we'll get into some of those details. But I think a thing I want to get right out front is the election, of course, had lots of messages to it. But one I want to focus on is folks are not satisfied with the economic institutions that they're facing today. I think that's part of what occurred. Part of what the message of the Trump campaign was. And we know, and I think a lot of your listeners know, that cooperatives provide a fantastic strategy for people to regain power in their economic life, because they provide the opportunity for people to own and control and benefit from the businesses that they deal with. So so I think this is there's some real opportunity for cooperatives to kind of stand tall as a strategy in this moment.
So when you say no faith in economic institutions, what are the institutions you're talking about?
Oh, the businesses. I mean, the way that people engage with, the major financial institutions, and they feel like they're being taken advantage of by the big national, banking institutions, the big retail conglomerates, Amazon and Walmart and some of the others that people feel like they're the product as opposed to they're just trying to buy a product. And, people's work, a lot of people are not very satisfied with their work. And that might be, certainly challenges related to salary and benefits, but also just the ability to have some control over your work life. And these are things where cooperatives can really provide some solutions. And they're not kind of marginal pie in the sky kind of stuff. Cooperatives have been around in the United States for well over 100 years. Vernon, you know very well that 1 in 3 people in the United States are members of cooperatives. Well over 100 million, maybe 110, 120 million people are members of credit unions. More than half of our food comes from these businesses, agribusinesses and food businesses that are owned and controlled by farmers. And then, of course, in rural places, the vast majority of electricity is provided by utilities that are owned and controlled by the people who live in rural places and through those rural electric cooperatives. So it's a proven model, but in certain areas like housing, it's a lot more interest in housing given the housing crisis in urban areas, in rural areas, in suburban areas. We look at the care economy, whether that's home care or child care, huge challenges there. And then opportunities relative to the digital economy, whether you call that platform or gig economy. Co-ops have a huge role to play. So, the question I think this post-election conversation is, how do we make sure that we get in and talk to those policymakers and help them realize that cooperatives can really answer a lot of today's challenges?
So when you say, I'm all the way back to economic institutions, I really hear you saying capitalistic institutions, those businesses that are focused mainly on profit first, and then there are secondary kinds of things, but co-ops are more into what's best for people, then the planet, and then profit. So
yeah. No, I think that's right, Vernon. In the genetic code of cooperatives put people first. It's the governance model. The way that cooperatives, it's one person, one vote. And so, typically, depending on the size of the cooperative, one person, one vote, they vote for a board. The board's comprised of fellow members, not some outside investment, whatevers, but people who are also members of the cooperative. That board hires some people, hires a manager, general manager, and the job of that general manager is to satisfy that board. Well, that board cares about the priorities of the members, not some outside investors that care only about profit. Now, co-ops are businesses. Co-ops need to be viable. The board, cares about the economic viability of this business that they want to use. So they're going to care about that too, but it's not going to be the priority.
Yes, we totally agree. Okay, so it's been really clear that the price of goods, the economy was perhaps the number one issue on people's mind when they went to the polls. Mm-hmm. And most people, as seen, believe that Trump was better than Kamala Harris in helping them at the dinner table kinds of issues, including food, okay, which is a biggie. So you've already mentioned that co-ops are better because it's for people, and I also said for the planet. What else do you see in this Trump administration from an economic standpoint that co-ops can really come in and help everyday people solve their problems? Yeah.
Well, something that actually the chair of the NCBA CLUSA board, who happens to be Esteban Kelly, Esteban, of course, is the president of U.S. Federation of Worker Co-ops as well. He and I were talking about this yesterday, and it appears from the message and the priorities communicated by Trump the Trump campaign, they're really focused on jobs here in the United States. You might want to call it reshoring, creating jobs for people here in the United States. Co-ops have a huge role to play, whether that's worker cooperatives. Of course, those are jobs in businesses that are owned and controlled by the people who are working in that business, or other types of cooperatives, consumer cooperatives, producer cooperatives. So I think cooperatives have a huge role as perhaps the federal government's going to be looking for ways to create jobs in the United States. Co-ops are a great place to create those jobs. So that's one place. Another place I think is it's going to be interesting to watch, and there's certain things that are going to be hard to predict, partly because some of the Trump agenda is not very predictable. He's not the most predictable federal official that we've seen.
Okay.
And also because the policies, some of the policies that he's advancing, exactly how they're going to work is not abundantly clear. And I'll take tariffs as an example. He has talked about putting into place very aggressive tariff regime, and how that affects the cooperative community, I think is a question mark, and it might be somewhat sector specific, because some sectors might actually benefit from essentially decreased competition from international firms, and other cooperatives are going to be at a significant disadvantage because they sell a lot of goods overseas. Particularly you've got to look at the agriculture cooperatives, soybeans, a lot of other commodities, and so there's we're going to have to watch that real closely. One other, and then I'll stop. But one other great big conversation that will happen in Washington D.C. next year is around tax policy. The big tax bill, the 2017 tax bill, that was one of the big priorities for the first Trump administration that was passed in 2017. A lot of those provisions will expire at the end of 2025. That's forcing a conversation on Capitol Hill on lots of tax policy. Obviously, co-ops are going to get caught up in that. And there's a few specific ones called, it kind of gets jargony, but it's called 199A, and it has to do with pass-through income. If Congress doesn't do something about that, it's really, really going to hurt farmer cooperatives and worker cooperatives. So we're real focused on that. And then there's just generally, last point I'll make is that the cooperative community needs to hang together to make sure that all of the sectors are taxed fairly. And when there's a big tax conversation like what will happen in 2025, you just need to be really wary of what could come out of that. So it's going to be a really important advocacy year next year.
Well, next year is a big year, period, because the UN has declared co-ops, the 2025 as a year of co-ops, as they did in 2012. And what is the role of NCBA in 2025?
Yeah, well, I'm glad you bring that up, and I think it's really closely connected to this policy environment that we find ourselves in. So this policy environment where we have a lot of new policymakers, we have people in different chairs who have some different priorities, and so it's a super important time for the co-op community to raise the flag, to make sure that policymakers understand the power of cooperatives, how cooperatives can solve problems and create economic opportunity. Great time for the International Year of the Co-ops. As you said, United Nations proclaimed it. The reason the 193 countries of the United Nations adopted a resolution making 2025 International Year of the Co-ops is because these leaders of these countries understand that co-ops can answer the problems of today. They can advance the economic and social goals that we have as a globe, that we have as individual countries. That might mean increased earnings, fair wages for women, making sure that we're putting into place strategies to deal with climate change, and many others. So we're going to use International Year of the Co-op as really a kind of a megaphone with our public policymakers and with the general public.
Well, you said that co-ops need one voice to make sure that we are heard. Do you see doing that one voice through the UN Year of the Co-op?
Sure. Yeah. We'll be joining the cooperative community across the world. Here in the United States, I mean, I'll just talk specifically. What are we going to do here in the U.S.? Well, we've already started to put together the materials that will help the cooperative community increase public awareness and improve advocacy in 2025. So that means we pulled together data from all across the different cooperative sectors, from the large cooperatives and small cooperatives, and we're putting that into a report that will be clear and compelling in terms of the scale, the scope, and the impact that cooperatives make in the United States of America. And then we will create a toolkit, if you will, that will primarily it'll be a social media toolkit so that cooperative associations and individual cooperatives can take the data and the stories from this report and tell it to their key audiences in a really compelling way. And really importantly, the toolkit will allow those cooperative associations or individual cooperatives to put themselves into this campaign, use their own stories, use their own data, so that local policymakers can really see the impact that co-ops have in their community.
And of course, Doug, we'd like to join you in that storytelling, getting that message out as much as we can, in every way that we can on Everything Co-op. Our little group has talked about that. We want to be highly involved as these stories come out, to get them on air, using social media and podcasts in every way we can to get this message out. That's why we are here, Everything Co-op, to get this message out. So let's work together in doing that. Okay, so we're looking at utilizing the Year of the Co-op to get the stories out and the messages out, speaking with one voice to policymakers, but to the whole U.S. population. That's 350 million people. And like you said, 100 and so odd million people are members of co-ops. Unfortunately, too often, if they're a member of a credit union or a rural electric co-op, a consumer co-op, they may not know that they're a member of a co-op. They may not know, when they get those little notices saying you can vote for the board, what that means. That they could run for the board, and they can also vote for the board, and therefore have a say in the operations of this business. Okay. Doug, are you looking forward to? It sounds like it may be kind of challenging here with the Trump administration. Are you looking forward to the challenge?
Oh, absolutely. The story that cooperatives have to tell, it's a great job to have. And when we think about the 6th cooperative principle, cooperation among cooperatives, which, if you look at the guidance notes, the International Cooperative Alliance guidance note, you realize that 6th cooperative principle is mostly about co-ops working together across associations and for purposes of public awareness and advocacy. So this is the year to really flex that 6th cooperative principle for us to work together to advocate for cooperatives, to improve the policy environment, and if we need to defend policies that right now make it possible for people to use cooperatives to solve problems and to capture economic opportunity. So, I'm looking forward to it. It's going to be a really active year, but there's a lot of good work to do.
I like good work to do. Okay. We have good work to do. All right. Change a little bit. You mentioned climate control. Trump has said he's going to cut climate regulations. He did it before in his first term, and he withdrew from the Paris Climate Agreement. I've also had people on this program talking about what co-ops do to help with reducing CO2 in the environment and helping with the climate issues. How do you see NCBA CLUSA working on the climate issues, particularly if Trump's administration is going to cut climate regulations?
Yeah. Well, such an important issue. The Biden administration has put into place, along with Congress, some really significant, really historic policy and resources for communities to deal with climate change, including some significant resources for utility cooperatives. So some real incentives, some real support for cooperatives to be able to transition to different types of fuel sources and different types of practices, not only in utilities, but in other types of cooperatives, small businesses that were able to leverage the resources. So that, I think the Trump campaign's been pretty clear that they plan to change some of those priorities. And we're going to have to watch, actually, in the first part of the administration on some of the resources that were passed by the Biden administration. They haven't been spent yet. So we're going to have to see what's going to happen to those resources. And, some of it's the way we think and frame this, to be honest. I think talking about climate, Trump folks aren't necessarily big fans of focusing and leading with climate, but I think they like resilient communities. They like to make sure that everyone, in the U.S. has the opportunity to have a safe place to live, to make sure that disasters aren't affecting them, or there's not a great likelihood that disasters will affect them. So I think that, two things kind of coming out of that is for NCBA CLUSA, we're going to continue to fight to make sure that cooperatives have a key role on community economic development. And today that does mean sustainable community economic development. And there's a nexus to climate there, no doubt. And the other thing is that no matter what policy that is advancing through Congress or proposed by a new administration, that co-ops get a fair shake, that they're not singled out or they're not forgotten about. And that's certainly what we're going to be focused on at NCBA.
Okay. I think we are going to have a lot to do. We're going to have a lot to do. And I like that you see it as it's going to be fun, exciting, keeping all the balls in the air. So we talked about Trump working on moving on the economy, tariffs, and also cutting climate regulations. How will his deporting undocumented migrants? He's promised the biggest mass deportation of undocumented migrants in our history, in the U.S. history. Mm-hmm. And there's a whole lot of questions about even how does he do it and how does he get money to do it and all of that. But putting that aside, if he's able to deport undocumented migrants, how does that affect co-ops? And I'm particularly thinking about the ag co-ops.
Yeah. It as you said, I think there's not abundant clarity on exactly how it's all going to roll out, and to the degree that the administration is going to do this. I mean, the first thing you do have to, I think, as you enter into this conversation, you think about the thousands or even millions of people, humans, that are going to be affected by this. I mean, this is and these people are part of our cooperative community, whether as members or as workers. So you just have to think about the human toll and how that will really impact people. You got to start with that. In terms of how it's going to affect businesses, I think you're right to maybe first think about the agriculture, the farmer cooperatives. It really depends on the type of commodity or the type of food that farmer co-op is processing. But many of them, they're in very labor-intensive sectors that require a lot of people, and they're jobs that migrant folks are working at right now. So if there's a significant disruption in that work, in the source of those workers, that could really disrupt, some of the. I think if you think about the food chain, kind of primarily California, the Florida cooperatives, fruits and vegetables, that could really disrupt that supply chain. And then even in some of the other food companies that are farmer cooperatives, that have significant processing, there may be a lot of people. So, but then others too. I mean, there's a lot of other businesses that rely on migrant or undocumented people to get the job done. And just exactly how this is rolled out and how it happens, it could be pretty significant.
So when you talk about disrupting the food chain, all I hear is prices for food will go up. Okay. That's what I hear there is particular fruits and vegetables, but pretty much anything around the food world could cause those prices to go up. And they are already, 12 to 20% higher than what they were when Biden came in. Inflation is down to 2.4%. So inflation's down, but the price of items are up significantly, and that's what I think most people are upset about.
Right. Yeah, I think there's one only needs to look to the disruption in supply chains in the early part of COVID, and that hit food prices as well as a lot of other sectors. And usually, not always, but usually when the prices go up, they don't come back down. It's kind of a ratchet. So, yeah.
We're going to have to take our first break, Doug. I'm really enjoying this conversation, hoping everybody out there listening is also, to look at the different policies that Trump is planning to put into place and basically how it affects each one of us. And we're looking at how it affects the cooperative businesses. We'll be right back. Please don't touch that dial.
News Talk 1450 WOL AM, where information is power.
Welcome back, everybody. This is Vernon Oaks, and we're talking to Doug O'Brien, who's the Executive Director of NCBA CLUSA. We're talking about the impact that Donald Trump coming in will have on co-ops in his new administration. So we've had a lively discussion the first half, and we want to get back into it. But Doug, do you know that we've finished our 11th year on air at the end of October? So we're into our 12th year now in November here. And National Co-op Bank has been our sponsor all of that time. NCB was created in the 80s to support co-ops and co-op members by providing innovative financial services. And they just do an excellent job of that. So if anybody out there, if you're a co-op or thinking about starting a co-op, you may want to go to ncb.coop and see if they can find some innovative financial services for you. Doug, I know you work a lot with NCB.
I do.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I get to work with NCB, with Casey Fannin, their CEO, and John Holtzclaw, their great executive vice president, who's also the CEO of Rochdale Capital, the CDFI. Yeah, we do work together because we have a lot of aligned priorities. One I'd like to mention, one we've been working on is on housing. So we mentioned just a little bit the housing crisis that is hitting everywhere around the country. We've been working
Can you define what that housing crisis is before you go into the solution of it? What is that housing crisis?
Well, I think it's two things. And Vernon, you know housing better than I do, so you can please add on or correct me. But it's affordability, really. There's a lot of families that are having a really difficult time finding housing that's affordable in a place that they really need to live for their jobs and lifestyle. And that affordability is connected to supply. So there's been, over the years, a really complicated set of both federal and local policies that make it hard for people to build new housing. And the result is that working class and low income people especially are having a hard time finding a place to live. So NCBA CLUSA has been working with the Cooperative Development Foundation. Of course, that's our affiliated 501c3, and a bunch of others in the co-op community. The UHAB, the national group that works on limited equity co-op housing with ROC, the resident-owned communities, which are cooperatives of people who live in manufactured housing, and others. On research on how people can use the cooperative business model to solve the housing crisis for a bunch of folks. That's especially with limited equity cooperative housing, and that's, to completely oversimplify it, it's cooperative housing that is subsidized in one way or the other. A lot of times it'd be subsidized up front, so that relatively low-income people can get into the place. And it's called limited equity cooperative housing because there's a limit on how much the increase in value that the resident can capture, so that if that person is there for 5 years, they're going to sell it and still in an affordable way to their share of that housing cooperative. So, when I mentioned there's policies, housing policies get really complicated really fast. It's federal, it's state, it's local, and so we're working on a set of recommendations for all of these types of policymakers to make it possible for more people to use cooperatives to increase, housing stock and make sure working class and lower income people can get decent housing.
So, I grew up in the co-op world. I grew up in housing. I've managed cooperative housing in Washington, D.C. area, Washington, Virginia, and Maryland. And when I was first introduced to limited equity housing, I was introduced by a white guy, and I thought it was white people trying to make sure that black people could not get equity. So I didn't like limited equity housing co-ops. And so I learned more and more and more about them. And you look at limited equity housing co-ops, and the option is go into an apartment building that's subsidized or homeless. I mean, there's and in the limited equity housing co-op, the benefits are so much more for the resident than going into a subsidized apartment building. One is, you already mentioned it, they have say-so. They get to vote on the board chair. They make decisions. They get to say how this housing will operate for them and their family. Do they put in a playground? Easy kinds of things. Do they replace the roof? Could be a hard decision because it's very expensive. But the people that live there make those decisions. And I found that in every variable you can think of, except one, there's only one variable where limited equity housing co-ops aren't better. Every variable is better for the resident. The only variable is not good for is the shareholder in the apartment building. They don't get to make the money. If there's money made, those residents get that money in terms of dividends. So I like limited equity housing co-ops, and that's what started me to loving housing co-ops, period, and learning how they work to other areas beside housing. So yes, there's a huge need. In the 50s and 60s, USDA had monies, the Congress had money to create, and that's where a lot of limited equity housing co-ops were created around the U.S., but here in Washington, D.C., Mayor Barry created monies for housing co-ops and had something called the first right of refusal, where it was called TOPA, which gave the tenants the first right of refusal to buy whenever a shareholder was selling their apartment building. Then the tenants could go in and buy it. And they put money in so people could get the training and get to know how to buy it and then how to operate it. So it's worked. I think there's 99 limited equity housing co-ops in D.C. today. So yeah, it's good. It's excellent. I love it. And has started in New York, and they've done just a phenomenal job in New York, and now they've gone national to help folks. And Rock USA, you mentioned them we called them trailer parks when I grew up. They're called mobile home parks today, but there's low-income people in these mobile home parks, and Rock has come in and helped them learn how to buy these mobile home parks and own them, where the residents own them and can have a say-so. So yeah, housing is exciting. It's one of the determinants of health, okay? A big determinant of health. And when you have some place that you can call your home, then the kids can do their homework. So it also helps the family in tremendous kinds of ways. So there's a lot for housing. Yeah. Okay. And there's a lot that co-ops can do in housing, and that's what you were talking about.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And I think more and more, and I suspect over the next year or two, we will see policymakers on the federal level, on the state level, on the municipal level that are going to bring forward resources and policy to help people build more housing, particularly affordable housing. And I think the task of the cooperative community is to make sure that co-ops are a significant part of that mix. And that means we've got to raise our hand, we got to knock on doors, we need to let folks know, and we need to show them with data and with really good stories on what these cooperative housing, what it can really mean for families.
Yep. Yep. And then the community.
Yeah.
There was a research that said that crime goes down in those limited equity housing co-ops compared to those apartment buildings. And that's because the people that live there, they own it, they know they own it, and they get that kind of ownership. And I've been in meetings, Doug, where the board member would say that, Sue's grandson is the one that's bringing these stolen cars into the place. And so they can help tell the police and work with the police and whomever they need to get Susie's grandchild some help, and also to make sure that those cars aren't stolen or drugs aren't in there and all of those kinds of things. So, yeah, crime goes down in limited equity housing co-ops. Quality of life goes up.
Right.
Phenomenal. Okay, so housing is one place. I'd like to talk a little bit when we talk about health, is this particular people in their 40s and 50s that are taking care of families and have child care, and they may be taking care of parents and have home health care, things that they have to be bothered with, and how co-ops can help in both of those incidents.
Yeah. No, that I think that's probably, along with housing, another of the key, I'll call it, sectors of crisis in the United States. And you just said it. Those families they may have their parents are getting into, 80s or 90s. At the same time, families, are having kids and they're dealing with child care that either is very expensive or simply does not exist. And a great way to solve these challenges is with co-ops. And they could be worker cooperatives. So the people who are working in home care, we've been, NCBA CLUSA and CDF, been working on this for over 10 years now, making sure that people understand that the home care entities, that there's an option for the people who work there, which are overwhelmingly women and typically way overrepresented relative to the community on people of color. So these are women who could have an opportunity to own their own business and their home care business. And we need a lot more of these. Really interesting about the home care, the worker-owned home care firms, that they get better outcomes. Kind of like you were talking about with the housing cooperatives, limited equity cooperating, there's better outcomes. In home care cooperatives, the people get paid more. The members do, the worker members. They have better benefits. They have more flexibility, which is really important. And by flexibility, I mean they have more control over their schedule, which is a really big deal in these firms when you're working for a firm that has to provide 24/7 care. And then the other thing is there's a lot less turnover. And because of all of this, and especially because of the decreased turnover, the clients, the people being taken care of, patients, if you will, their health is better. And their health is better because their caretakers are consistent. Their caretakers tend to have better training. Their caretakers are happier in their work. And you're going to get healthier people at the end of the day.
It's so phenomenal. It's like, why don't we have more?
Yeah. And why we don't have more? So it's because of policy. It's the way that the federal support for elder care works. It disadvantages home care, in particular worker-owned home care. Something we've been working on for a number of years, but it very well could be over the next couple of years this issue will come to a fore, and we need to be there as a cooperative community to make sure that these policymakers understand the advantages of worker-owned home care.
So I did have on the show the executive director of the home health care in Bronx. It's 1,500 members. These are the people that provide the home health care, own the business. There's 1,500 people, which is one of the largest worker-owned co-ops that we have in the U.S. And he was saying that one of the things is getting Medicare, getting the federal government to get Medicare to pay more, because to limit what they can pay these workers, and to get a better fair living price, they need Medicare to increase what they will allow people to make.
Yeah, that is the key. I think the key kind of policy lever is making sure that the Medicare reimbursement rate treats worker-owned home care cooperatives in a way that's really fair, and it makes it possible to pay the worker owners a fair wage. I mean, that's the hurdle right now. And if we want as a society to significantly increase the supply of home care, which every survey indicates that's what people want. Yeah, it's what we want. The numbers, just the demographic numbers, we know that there's significantly increasing number of people who are heading towards elder care kind of situation, and people want to stay at home. And people, in a lot of ways, you measure it, they get better outcomes when they're at home. So yeah, with the change in that reimbursement rate, and that's one of the things we've been working on.
Okay, so that's a federal policy that needs to happen. You're saying that federal, state, and local.
Yeah.
So what are some of the things that at the state or local level that we must be concerned with in the co-op community to get the kinds of policies that we need to move forward?
I'll just stay with home care for a minute. The state of Washington has some really advantageous state laws in terms of the Medicaid reimbursement rate. So Medicaid, of course, is sort of the first cousin of Medicare, and the state has a lot more influence on how that reimbursement formula works. Result is, in Washington State, I don't know the number off the top of my head, but there's significantly more home care worker cooperatives in the state of Washington than any other state. And it's because there's a better policy. Actually, I mean, you could take a step back that they did have a number of them. And like other sectors, once you have a number of co-ops that can prove the efficacy and the wisdom of using co-ops, then they can work with their policy makers, and the policymakers can create more supportive structures. That could be funding, like in a reimbursement formula. It could be for technical assistance, so that there's more cooperative development professionals. It could be the state or the federal, the state or the local entity could help create greater access into capital. Could be guaranteed loans. Could be some initial startup grants, and we've seen it all over the board, and in all over the country, actually, that states, and in particular, Colorado is really active, but not only Colorado, some other states at the state level, but then cities, the city of Denver in Colorado, of course, but New York City's had some interesting things. More recently, Chicago, Philadelphia has quite a history. The city of Austin in Texas, where you have ordinances that are supporting cooperatives. And in fact, right in our backyard, Vernon, in Washington, D.C., there have been, and you know very well, a history of different city council members or mayors who understand what cooperatives can do, and they use that municipal policy making to provide people the cooperative option.
You didn't mention Madison, Wisconsin.
I didn't, but I was there 2.5 weeks ago. Yeah, it was a great.
So I was just thinking about those cities that had provided the funding. New York was like, I don't know, 2.5 million a year for 5 years or something, and Madison was $1 million a year for 5 years. Colorado is, and the governor there has just been really interesting in what they're doing, and I get to see that through the Rock USA model, the mobile home parks, and the work that they're doing there, and the money that they have available to help the residents own those properties. So funding, technical assistance, and you mentioned Esteban Kelly. I was asking him at the Hall of Fame dinner, why don't we look at increasing? I think we have 1,300 worker co-ops in the U.S. is what's expected. They can name about 800 of those, where they are and so forth. Why don't we try to get 5 times that 1,300 in like 3 years? And he was saying the technical assistance is the main drawback. How long it takes to get a worker co-op up and going, and the technical assistance we just don't have enough of it. So that would be one place, according to him, because when you look at the benefits of worker co-ops, and I think of Shy Fresh in Chicago, 5 formerly incarcerated people, I think 4 women, 1 male, I think all African Americans, create a very successful business. Oh, and I saw at the worker conference, Kim, I met her. She's one of the workers that started that. She said, I didn't think I could own a car, let alone a business. That's the way she started her presentation. So, yeah, to be able to be a part owner of a business and have the say-so and get the training. And Doug, that's what I so much enjoyed about learning about affordable housing co-ops, limited equity housing co-ops, was that how everyday people, mostly women, mostly black women here in D.C., could make very intelligent decisions without an MBA or too often without a college degree, maybe at best a high school degree. They get the necessary training to make very informed decisions and carry a meeting and hold each other accountable. That's what I like most, and that's the 5th principle. You mentioned the 6th one. The 5th principle of education, training, and information of cooperation is what I end up loving and falling in love with the co-op model, the training that people get. Okay.
Yeah.
So we got the state level, local level, federal level. So Trump has been talking about reducing the federal workforce and maybe getting some help from one of them billionaire guys. But how would that affect the co-op?
Well, I approach this from the perspective of somebody who worked in the federal government. I was a political appointee, so as soon as the guy I was working for was Barack Obama. As soon as he was done with office, I was gone. That's the way that works, that's perfectly fine. Mm-hmm. What President Trump has been talking about is using executive authority to reclassify a bunch of the career civil servants at the U.S. Department of Agriculture, at Housing and Urban Development, at Department of Labor, and then removing a bunch of them for, I'm not sure exactly on what how those decisions would be made. How that would affect is that if what the cooperative community wants to do is work more effectively with HUD to build out limited equity cooperative houses, or work with the U.S. Department of Agriculture to create more cooperatives in rural areas, or with the Department of Labor to increase that technical assistance for people looking to establish worker cooperatives, there's going to be less people there, and there's going to be a lot of disruption at those agencies. So that's a concern, I think, for the cooperative community. If what we're doing is trying to look to partner with the federal government to help more people use cooperatives, this could be a hurdle. So that's something, another thing we're going to have to watch early in the administration. Okay.
And I think that could be a big one. You mentioned the 3 biggies, and then there's also the SBA. If you get rid of people there, when you get rid of people, you get rid of that institutional knowledge.
Yeah.
And that's one of the problems in HUD anyway, is because a lot of people that knew about putting together limited equity housing co-ops in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s are no longer there. They retired. They moved on. And so HUD doesn't have that institutional knowledge of how they did that in the past. So if you go and let people go, I can see that. I can see that a lot.
Yeah. Now, that's not to say, the federal government, just like any other type of business, including cooperatives, you always need to be looking at how you can use, the people who work with you, work for you in the most effective way, making sure you're using technology, etc. But it could be done in a way that it could be more, could be disruptive, especially in the short term.
Okay. So can you step back a minute? We've been looking at specifics and just broad brush. How does this election affect NCBA? And I'm really thinking about your congressional caucus and the number of people that have changed in the Senate and in the House that used to be on your caucus that are no longer there. How do you see building that caucus back up and getting this federal support?
Yeah, that's a great question. As you allude to, Vernon, we at NCBA CLUSA have for years helped, kind of create and foster the Congressional Cooperative Business Caucus. So it's a caucus of, this is in the House. The Senate doesn't have caucuses, actually, formal caucuses. So in the House, we have anywhere from, in a given year, from 20 to 25 representatives. And we are very deliberate about making sure that it remains bipartisan. So we have co-chairs, one who's a Democrat, one who's a Republican, and then we make sure that the numbers don't get too lopsided one way or the other. And the reason is because elections happen. And I mean, the last, 10 or 14 years, the House has switched, I'm going to say 5 times off the top of my head. And so we need good relationships with leaders on both sides, and we have that. And we can do that as a cooperative community because cooperatives are a bipartisan strategy. One side might like the idea a little bit more of how co-ops, provide greater opportunity to workers or to low-income people. The other side might like it that co-ops provide access to critical needs and services, provide scale to small businesses so that they can compete. But there's important characteristics about cooperatives that everyone likes. So we'll continue to work with that Congressional Business Caucus, and like every new Congress, there's a number of them that have either retired or have moved on, and we're looking for new partners, and we're starting that right now.
Doug, in the last minute or so, what message would you like to leave people with?
Co-ops are as relevant today as they ever have been. That's because people are looking for better answers in the way that they engage with their economy. And co-ops are one of those answers. Co-ops give people the ability to own, control, and benefit from the businesses that they use. So that's got to be number one. And number two, not everybody knows this. We got to tell people, and particularly we got to tell policymakers and the new policymakers that are coming into Congress. There's going to be new folks coming in with the new Trump administration. And so as a cooperative community, 2025 is the International Year of the Co-ops, and it is the year to increase public awareness and improve advocacy for cooperatives here in the United States and across the world.
Doug, thank you so very much for work that you do. I'm really impressed and at what all you get accomplished. Thank you for it. I think the U.S. is better off from your work that you do, and I think the world is also. Thank you. And everybody else, we'll see you next Thursday. We ask you to please live cooperatively.
News Talk 1450 WOL AM, where information is power.
The preceding program was paid for by Everything Co-op.